The galactic transit station buzzed with the usual chaos of 1,000 different species going about their daily business. Merchants hawked exotic wares from distant worlds. Diplomats hurried between meetings, and travelers waited for connections to far-flung corners of the galaxy. The massive structure, built at the intersection of 3 major hyperspace lanes, served as a melting pot where civilization's many forms collided and mixed. In the lower dining concourse, a young Zilani female sat alone at a corner table, her pale blue skin seeming to shimmer under the harsh artificial lighting. Her large, violet eyes darted nervously around the crowded space as she picked at her meal with trembling fingers. The Zilani were known throughout the galaxy for their peaceful nature and extraordinary empathic abilities. But this particular trait that made them valuable as mediators and counselors also made them vulnerable in less civilized company. Kira, as her identification tag read, was barely past adolescence by her species standards. She wore the simple gray robes of a diplomatic apprentice, indicating she was likely traveling as part of some official delegation. Her delicate features and nervous demeanor marked her as an easy target for the kind of beings who preyed on weakness. At a nearby table, a group of Vorthon mercenaries had noticed the young Zilani. The Vorthons were a warrior species, built like walking tanks with thick armored hide and multiple sets of arms. Their culture valued strength above all else, and they had little patience for what they saw as weakness in other species. The largest of them, a scarred veteran named Gracchus, pointed at Kira with one of his 4 massive hands. "Look at that pathetic creature," he growled in the common galactic tongue, his voice carrying easily across the dining area. "Sitting there shaking like a leaf. No wonder the Zilani never amount to anything in this galaxy." His companions laughed, a harsh sound that made other diners glance nervously in their direction. The Vorthons were known for their aggressive behavior, and most species gave them a wide berth when possible. Security on the station was typically light, as the various galactic laws and treaties were supposed to ensure peaceful conduct in neutral territories. Gracchus stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow across several tables as he approached Kira. The young Zilani looked up with wide, frightened eyes as the mercenary loomed over her. Her empathic abilities were no doubt picking up the hostile emotions radiating from the group, making their malicious intent feel like physical blows. "What's wrong, little empath?" Gracchus sneered, leaning down so his scarred face was close to hers. "Can you feel how much we despise your kind? Your weakness makes us sick." Kira pressed herself back in her chair, but there was nowhere to go. The Vorthons had positioned themselves to block any escape routes. Around the dining area, other patrons pretended not to notice what was happening. The unwritten rule of places like this was to mind your own business, especially when it came to species conflicts. "Please," Kira whispered, her voice barely audible. "I haven't done anything to you." "You exist," another Vorthon spat. "That's enough. Your people hide behind your empathic abilities, claiming to be peacekeepers while never having the courage to actually fight for anything. You're parasites." One of the mercenaries reached out and grabbed Kira's meal tray, dumping its contents onto the floor with a crash that echoed through the dining area. The sound made everyone freeze momentarily before they quickly returned to pretending nothing was happening. "Oops," the Vorthon said with mock concern. "How clumsy of me. Maybe you should clean that up, empath. Get down on your hands and knees where you belong." Tears began to flow down Kira's cheeks, her emotional control breaking under the assault of their hatred and her own fear. Her hands shook as she started to rise from her chair, clearly intending to comply with their demand rather than risk further confrontation. It was at that moment that a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Well, well, what do we have here?" The voice belonged to a human, and every being in the dining area felt a chill run down their spines. Humans had only recently joined the galactic community, but they had already earned a reputation that preceded them wherever they went. They were unpredictable, often illogical, and possessed a stubborn streak that bordered on insanity when they decided to take a stand. The human in question appeared to be a fairly typical example of his species. Medium, height with brown hair and unremarkable features. He wore the casual clothing of a civilian traveler, nothing that marked him as military or security. To most species, he would seem completely harmless, but the Vorthons, like many others, had heard the stories about what humans were capable of when pushed too far. "This is none of your concern, human," Gracchus growled, though he straightened up slightly. "Walk away." The human smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both friendly and deeply unsettling. He walked closer to the group, his movements casual and unthreatening. As he approached, he rolled up his sleeves with deliberate slowness. "You know what?" the human said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "I was having a perfectly good day. Just finished a 3-week cargo run. Looking forward to a quiet meal and maybe catching a transport to somewhere with actual beaches." He paused next to Kira's table, glancing down at the spilled food and then at the tears on her face. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "But then I see this," he continued, gesturing at the scene before him. "A bunch of oversized bullies picking on someone who couldn't hurt a fly if she tried. And that just doesn't sit right with me." The largest Vorthon took a step toward the human, using his considerable size advantage to try to intimidate him. "I said walk away, human. This is your last warning." The human looked up at Gracchus, completely unimpressed by the display of physical superiority. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small bottle of beer, twisting off the cap with a casual flick of his wrist. The action seemed completely random, adding to the surreal nature of the confrontation. "You know what, big guy?" the human said, taking a sip of his beer and then looking around for someone to hand it to. His eyes settled on a nervous-looking merchant at a nearby table. "Hold my beer." The confused alien merchant automatically accepted the bottle, not understanding the significance of the gesture. But several other humans in the dining area suddenly perked up, recognizing the phrase and what it typically preceded. What happened next would become legend among the various species of the galaxy, a story told and retold in bars and ships across known space. It would serve as yet another example of why humans, despite their recent arrival on the galactic stage, were already considered one of the most dangerous species anyone might encounter. The Vorthons thought they understood violence. They were about to learn the difference between being warriors and being human. Marcus Chen had been traveling through space for the better part of 5 years since humanity first made contact with the galactic community. As a freight hauler, he had seen more of the galaxy than most humans, and he had learned to navigate the complex web of species politics that governed daily life among the stars. He knew when to keep his head down, when to speak up, and when to just walk away from trouble. This was not one of those walk-away moments. The silence in the dining area stretched out like a held breath as Marcus stepped closer to the group of Vorthons. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had been in similar situations before. His hands relaxed at his sides despite the obvious threat posed by the 4 heavily muscled aliens surrounding the young Zilani. "Here's the thing," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet space. "I've been all over this galaxy, and I've learned something interesting about bullies. They're pretty much the same no matter what species they belong to." Gracchus, the lead Vorthon, flexed his forearms in an intimidating display. Each of his limbs was as thick as Marcus's torso, and his hide was scarred from countless battles. The other mercenaries spread out slightly, forming a loose circle that would make escape difficult for either Marcus or Kira. "You humans think you're so special," one of the other Vorthons sneered. "Just because you've won a few battles against pirates and raiders. We are Vorthon warriors. We have been fighting wars since before your species learned to make fire." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering this point. "That's probably true. But here's what I've noticed about warriors who pick fights with kids in restaurants. They're usually not very good at being warriors." The insult hit home, and Marcus could see the anger building in their alien features. Vorthons pride themselves on their martial honor, and suggesting they weren't real warriors was one of the deepest insults possible in their culture. "You dare question our honor?" Gracchus roared, his voice causing several nearby diners to flinch. "I have killed more enemies than you have seen battles, human." "Maybe," Marcus replied calmly. "But right now you're threatening a girl who's probably not even old enough to vote on her homeworld. So either you're not as tough as you think or you're exactly as honorable as I think." Behind him, Kira remained pressed against her chair, watching the confrontation with wide, terrified eyes. Her empathic abilities were picking up the complex mix of emotions swirling through the room. The Vorthon's rage, Marcus's calm determination, and the fearful anticipation of the other diners who sensed that violence was about to erupt. What the young Zilani couldn't understand was why Marcus felt so calm. Most species would be terrified facing 4 Vorthon warriors. Their reputation for brutality was well-deserved, and they possessed both the size and skill to back up their threats. But Marcus's emotional state remained steady, almost relaxed, as if he was exactly where he wanted to be. The largest Vorthan stepped forward, raising one of his massive fists. "Enough talk. I will crush you like the insect you are." "Probably," Marcus agreed, seeming to consider the possibility seriously. "You're definitely bigger than me. Stronger too, I'm guessing. Better trained in combat, more experience, superior reach and leverage." The admission seemed to confuse the Vorthans, who had expected either fear or bravado from the human. Gracchus paused, his fist still raised but not yet descending. "Then why do you stand against us?" another Vorthan demanded. Marcus glanced back at Kira, then returned his attention to the group surrounding them. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "Because someone has to." The simple statement hung in the air for a moment before Marcus continued. "See, that's the thing about humans. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy. We're not the smartest or the fastest or the most advanced, but we have this really annoying habit of doing things just because they need doing." He took a step closer to Gracchus, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the alien could literally tear him apart with his bare hands. "Your people value strength above all else. I get that. But strength without purpose is just violence. And violence without cause is just bullying." The other diners in the area had begun to slowly edge away from the confrontation, recognizing that whatever was about to happen, they didn't want to be caught in the middle of it. Even the station's security cameras had begun to swivel toward their location, though no security personnel had yet appeared. "You think your philosophy will save you, human?" Gracchus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal walls. "I will show you what Vorthan strength really means." Marcus smiled again, that same unsettling expression that had worried the aliens from the beginning. "You know what, please do. I'd hate to think I misjudged the situation." What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the witnesses would struggle to describe it accurately in their later reports. Gracchus brought his fist down in a devastating blow that should have crushed Marcus's skull. The human, however, was no longer where the fist was aimed. Humans, it turned out, had evolved on a world that was constantly trying to kill them. Their reflexes had been honed by millions of years of avoiding predators, natural disasters, and each other. What looked like superhuman speed to most galactic species was simply the result of an evolutionary arms race that had produced beings capable of reacting to threats with split-second timing. Marcus rolled to the side, letting the massive fist slam into the table where he had been standing. The reinforced metal crumpled under the impact, but the human was already moving, his own much smaller fist connecting with a nerve cluster just below Gracchus's armored hide. The Vorthan warrior stumbled, more from surprise than pain, but that moment of confusion was all Marcus needed. He grabbed one of the broken pieces of the table and swung it with surgical precision at another vulnerable point on the alien's anatomy. "The thing about being smaller," Marcus said conversationally as he continued to move, staying just ahead of the increasingly frustrated Vorthan attacks, "is that you learn to be creative." The other three Vorthans tried to join the fight, but the confined space of the dining area worked against them. Their size, which should have been an advantage, became a liability as they got in each other's way. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be everywhere at once, striking quickly and then disappearing before they could retaliate. It wasn't that he was winning exactly. The Vorthans were simply too tough and too numerous for that. But he wasn't losing either. And every second the fight continued, more beings in the dining area began to take notice. Some were recording the confrontation on personal devices, while others began to whisper among themselves about what they were witnessing. A human, alone and outnumbered, had chosen to stand up to 4 Vorthan warriors to protect someone he didn't even know. It was exactly the kind of behavior that was making humanity's reputation spread throughout the galaxy, usually accompanied by a mixture of admiration and concern about what these newcomers might do next. The fight had been going on for nearly 3 minutes, which was approximately 2 minutes and 50 seconds longer than anyone watching had expected a human to survive against 4 Vorthan warriors. Marcus was bleeding from several cuts where their claws had managed to graze him, and his breathing was becoming labored from the constant movement required to stay ahead of their attacks. But he was still standing, still fighting, and still protecting the young Zalani who watched in amazement from behind her overturned table. What the observers didn't understand was that Marcus wasn't trying to win in any conventional sense. He was buying time and making a point. Two things that humans excelled at in equal measure. Every second the fight continued was another second for word to spread through the station's communication networks. Every blow he managed to land was another small crack in the Vorthon reputation for invincibility. Gracchus, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow on the much smaller human, made the mistake of reaching for his weapon. The plasma pistol at his side was a military-grade piece that could cut through most forms of personal armor. Drawing it in a civilian area was a serious violation of station regulations, but the mercenary was past caring about such niceties. "Enough games," he snarled, pulling the weapon from its holster. "I will end this now." The sight of the plasma weapon changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Several diners screamed and dove for cover, while others began frantically calling for station security. Weapons fire in a civilian area could breach the station's hull if it went through the wrong bulkhead, potentially killing hundreds of beings. Marcus stopped moving for the first time since the fight began. His hands raised as the barrel of the weapon tracked him. His face showed no fear, only a kind of grim satisfaction that suggested this was exactly what he had been hoping would happen. "Really?" he asked conversationally. "A military weapon against an unarmed civilian? In front of all these witnesses?" "No one will care about one dead human," Gracchus replied, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. Around them, the crowd of onlookers was growing larger as word of the confrontation spread through the station. "Maybe not," Marcus agreed, "but they'll care about this." Before Gracchus could ask what he meant, the dining area was suddenly flooded with new arrivals. They came from every direction, humans who had been scattered throughout the station but had received word that one of their own was in trouble. They moved with purpose and coordination that spoke of military training. Even though most appeared to be civilians, Dr. Sarah Kim had been examining exotic plant samples in the station's botanical section when the alert reached her personal communicator. She arrived carrying what appeared to be a simple medical bag, but anyone familiar with human military history would have recognized the confident way she moved through a potential combat zone. Captain Torres emerged from the direction of the docking bays, still wearing the casual clothes of an off-duty merchant marine officer. Behind him came several crew members from various human vessels, their expressions grim as they took in the scene. From the upper levels came Elena Vasquez, a cultural attaché who had been attending a diplomatic reception. She was accompanied by two beings that made several aliens in the crowd take involuntary steps backward. Genna warriors, members of a species known for their loyalty to those who earned their respect. But perhaps most unsettling was the arrival of an elderly human woman who appeared to be nothing more than a tourist. Margaret Foster had been exploring the station's historical exhibits when word reached her, and she had come as quickly as her aged legs would carry her. What the aliens couldn't know was that she was a veteran of the Battle of Kepler Station, where human forces had held off a numerically superior pirate fleet for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. In less than 2 minutes, the dining area had gone from containing one isolated human to hosting nearly 20 members of humanity, along with several aliens who had apparently chosen to stand with them. The Vortons found themselves outnumbered for the first time, facing beings who showed no fear of their weapons or their reputation. "Gracchus of House Vorth," Captain Torres said formally, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "You are in violation of Galactic Safety Protocol 7 by drawing a military weapon in a civilian area. I suggest you holster that pistol before this situation escalates beyond your ability to control it." The Vorthon warrior looked around at the crowd that had gathered, noting the grim expressions and ready stances of the humans surrounding him. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to realize that he might have made a serious error in judgment. "This is a private matter," he growled, though he did not lower his weapon. The human interfered in something that was none of his concern. Dr. Kim stepped forward, her medical scanner already out and running diagnostics on Marcus's injuries. "Protecting someone from bullies is always a human concern," she said calmly. "It's kind of our thing." Margaret Foster moved through the crowd with surprising speed for someone her age, positioning herself directly between the weapon and young Kira. "You want to shoot someone? You'll have to go through me first," she said matter-of-factly. "And I've been shot before. It's unpleasant, but it's not the worst thing that's ever happened to me." The casual way she dismissed the threat of the plasma weapon sent a chill through the watching aliens. What kind of species produced elderly females who were willing to step in front of military-grade weapons to protect strangers? Elena Vasquez was speaking quietly into her communication device, no doubt reporting the situation to higher authorities. The presence of a diplomatic attaché meant that this incident would likely become an official matter between governments, something that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. But it was the Genna warriors that truly drove home the gravity of the situation. These beings were known throughout the galaxy as honor-bound fighters who chose their allies carefully. The fact that they had apparently decided to stand with the humans sent a clear message about which side they believed was in the right. "Stand down," one of the Genna rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "You dishonor yourself and your people with this display." Gracchus looked around the dining area, finally beginning to understand that what had started as a simple bit of bullying had somehow escalated into a potential diplomatic incident. The plasma pistol suddenly felt very heavy in his hand, and the other Vorthan warriors were looking decidedly uncomfortable with the direction things had taken. Marcus, still standing calmly in the center of the confrontation despite his injuries, spoke into the tense silence. "You know what the funny thing is? All you had to do was leave her alone. Just walk away and mind your own business. But you couldn't do that, could you?" He gestured toward Kira, who was now surrounded by protective humans but still watching the scene with wide, fearful eyes. "She never did anything to you, never hurt anyone, but you saw someone vulnerable and decided that made her fair game." The human's voice carried clearly through the dining area, and his words were being recorded by dozens of personal devices. This incident would spread through the galactic networks within hours, becoming another chapter in humanity's growing reputation. "So here's what's going to happen next," Marcus continued, his tone still conversational despite the blood running down his face. "You're going to put that weapon away, apologize to the young lady, and walk out of here. And in exchange, we're going to pretend this was all just a misunderstanding." The offer seemed remarkably generous considering the circumstances, but there was something in the way Marcus said it that suggested it wasn't really a request. The standoff stretched on for several heartbeats as Gracchus weighed his options. Around him, the dining area had become a powder keg of tension, with dozens of beings watching to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. The plasma pistol in his hand represented not just a weapon, but a choice between escalation and de-escalation that could have far-reaching consequences. Station security had finally arrived, but they remained at the perimeter of the confrontation, clearly unsure how to proceed. The lead security officer was a Zentorian, a species known for their diplomatic approach to conflict resolution, but even their extensive training hadn't prepared them for a situation involving armed Vorthan, mercenaries facing off against an apparent gathering of humans. "Sir," the security officer called out carefully, "we need all weapons lowered immediately. This area must be secured for the safety of all civilians." Gracchus glanced toward the security team, noting their light armor and standard-issue stun weapons. Against his military-grade plasma pistol, they would be severely outgunned if the situation turned violent. But the presence of official station authority added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Meanwhile, Marcus remained motionless in the center of the confrontation, his eyes never leaving Gracchus's face. Despite his injuries and the weapon pointed at him, he showed no signs of backing down. To the watching aliens, his behavior seemed either incredibly brave or completely insane. Dr. Kim had finished her preliminary scan of Marcus's injuries and was now positioning herself to provide medical assistance to anyone who might need it. Her presence served as a reminder that humans came prepared for multiple contingencies, even in what should have been routine civilian situations. Captain Torres stepped forward slightly, his hands visible and empty but his posture indicating readiness for action. "Gracchus," he said in a calm, professional tone. "I've been reviewing the station's surveillance footage. The entire incident has been recorded from multiple angles. Your actions here today will be reviewed by both station authorities and your own people." The implication was clear. Even if Gracchus managed to silence the immediate witnesses, the electronic evidence would remain. The Vorthan warrior's reputation, and that of his entire mercenary company, would be judged based on how he chose to proceed. Elena Vasquez finished her communication and approached the group, her diplomatic credentials clearly displayed. "I've just spoken with both the Human Colonial Authority and the Vorthan Embassy," she announced. "Both governments are very interested in how this situation resolves itself." The mention of official government involvement caused a visible ripple of unease through the watching crowd. What had started as a local incident was rapidly becoming an interstellar matter that could affect relations between entire species. Young Kira, still sheltered behind her overturned table, found her voice for the first time since the confrontation began. "Please," she said, her words barely audible but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "I don't want anyone to be hurt because of me." Her plea seemed to affect several of the aliens in the crowd, reminding them of what had started this entire situation. The sight of the young Zelani, clearly terrified but concerned for others even in her fear, served as a stark contrast to the armed confrontation playing out around her. Margaret Foster, the elderly human woman who had positioned herself as a human shield, spoke up with the authority of someone who had seen enough conflict to understand its true cost. "Child," she said gently, "this isn't about you anymore. This is about the kind of galaxy we want to live in." Her words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire dining area. The various species represented in the crowd began to murmur among themselves, discussing the implications of what they were witnessing. Some had communication devices out, no doubt reporting the incident to their own governments or news networks. Gracchus could see his situation deteriorating with each passing moment. What should have been a simple display of Vorthon superiority had become a galactic incident that would likely follow him for the rest of his career. The plasma pistol in his hand, which had seemed like the solution to his problems just minutes earlier, now felt like the weight of poor decisions made in anger. One of his fellow mercenaries, a younger Vorthon named Orcs, stepped closer and spoke in their native language. The words were too quiet for the universal translators to pick up, but the tone suggested urgent advice about the wisdom of continuing their current course of action. Marcus, still waiting patiently for Gracchus to make his choice, finally spoke again. "You know what I think?" he said conversationally. "I think you're a better warrior than this. Real fighters don't pick on kids and they don't draw weapons they're not prepared to use." The statement was simultaneously an insult and an offer of redemption, delivered in the calm tone that had characterized Marcus's behavior throughout the entire confrontation. It was a very human approach to conflict resolution, acknowledging the opponent's potential for honor while calling out their current failure to live up to it. The Genna warriors had remained silent since their initial intervention, but their presence continued to influence the situation. Their species' reputation for recognizing true honor meant that their obvious support for the human position carried significant weight with many of the observers. Dr. Kim took advantage of the momentary lull to approach Kira, her medical scanner indicating no serious physical injuries, but detecting elevated stress indicators that suggested the young Zelani was close to emotional collapse. "Breathe," she said gently, her training in interspecies psychology showing as she adjusted her approach for Zelani emotional responses. The security team remained at the ready, but their leader was clearly hoping for a peaceful resolution. Station regulations required them to intervene if weapons were discharged, but the current standoff fell into a gray area that required careful navigation. Captain Torres checked his personal communicator and frowned slightly. "Gracchus," he said formally, "I'm receiving reports that this incident is already being broadcast on several galactic news networks. In approximately 10 minutes, this dining area is going to be the most famous location in this sector of space." The information seemed to be the final straw for the Vorthon warrior. His hand began to shake slightly as the full implications of his situation became clear. He was about to become the face of his species' approach to conflict, and that face would be seen by billions of beings across the galaxy. Slowly, very slowly, Gracchus began to lower his weapon. The collective sigh of relief from the watching crowd was audible as the immediate threat of violence began to recede. But everyone present understood that the real test would come in the next few minutes, as the various parties involved decided how to move forward from this unprecedented confrontation. The galaxy was watching, and humanity had once again found itself at the center of events that would shape interspecies relations for years to come. What happened next would either help establish humans as a stabilizing force in galactic affairs, or mark them as a species too dangerous to be allowed free access to civilized space. As Gracchus holstered his plasma pistol, the tension in the dining area shifted but didn't disappear entirely. The Vorthon warrior's face showed a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been grudging respect. The other mercenaries stepped back slightly, clearly relieved that their leader had chosen de-escalation over potential catastrophe. Marcus wiped blood from a cut above his eye and nodded acknowledgement of Gracchus's decision. "That's a start," he said simply. "Now comes the hard part." The hard part, as it turned out, was navigating the complex web of galactic law, species politics, and personal honor that had been stirred up by the confrontation. Elena Vasquez stepped forward, her diplomatic training taking over as she began to manage what was rapidly becoming an interstellar incident. According to Galactic Conflict Resolution Protocol, she began formally, all parties involved in this altercation have the right to request mediation through neutral arbiters. However, given the public nature of this incident and the weapons violation, station authorities also have jurisdiction. The security team leader, relieved that violence had been avoided, approached the group with visible caution. "All individuals involved will need to provide statements for our investigation," he announced. "However, if all parties are willing to participate in voluntary mediation, we can handle this through diplomatic channels rather than criminal proceedings." It was a face-saving offer for everyone involved, but it required cooperation from both sides. The humans seemed willing to pursue peaceful resolution, but the Vorthon response remained unclear. Gracchus looked around at the crowd of witnesses, many of whom were still recording the proceedings. His reputation as a warrior was already damaged, but how he handled the next few minutes could determine whether that damage was permanent. Vorthon culture valued strength, but it also respected honorable conduct in defeat. He began, then stopped, clearly struggling with words that went against everything his culture had taught him about showing weakness. The silence stretched out uncomfortably as he wrestled with concepts that had no easy translation in his native language. It was young Kira who broke the deadlock. Despite her fear and the trauma of the last few minutes, she stood up from behind her overturned table and walked slowly toward the group of mercenaries. Dr. Kim moved to intercept her, concerned for her safety, but Marcus held up a hand to let the Zelani approach. "I forgive you," Kira said simply, her voice still shaking but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I know you were angry, and anger makes people do things they don't really want to do." The statement was so unexpected, so contrary to what anyone had anticipated, that it seemed to paralyze the entire dining area. Here was the victim of the harassment, offering forgiveness to beings who had threatened and humiliated her just minutes earlier. Gracchus stared down at the young Zelani, his alien features showing confusion and something that might have been shame. In Vorthon culture, enemies were to be defeated or destroyed, not forgiven. The concept of mercy from a victim to their tormentor was almost incomprehensible. "Why?" he asked, the universal translator struggling with the emotional undertones in his native language. Kira looked up at him with those large, violet eyes that had shown such fear earlier. "Because holding on to anger hurts me more than it hurts you," she said. "And because I think you're not really a bad person, just someone who made bad choices." Margaret Foster nodded approvingly. "Smart girl," she said quietly. "Wisdom beyond her years." The elderly human's comment seemed to resonate with several of the other species present. The Zentorians in particular were known for their appreciation of philosophical insights, and several of them began murmuring approval of Kira's approach. Captain Torres stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to build on the young Zelani's gesture. "The human position," he said formally, "is that this incident arose from a misunderstanding that was escalated by poor communication and cultural differences. We're willing to treat it as a learning experience rather than a criminal matter. It was a diplomatic way of offering the Vorthons a way out while still holding them accountable for their actions." Elena Vasquez nodded her approval of the captain's statement, indicating that it had official backing from human authorities. Dr. Kim was still monitoring both Marcus's injuries and Kira's emotional state. "I'd like to suggest that all parties involved participate in a cultural exchange program," she said, her medical background informing her understanding of conflict resolution. "Sometimes the best way to prevent future incidents is through education and understanding." The suggestion was met with murmurs of interest from several species in the crowd. Cultural exchange programs were a well-established method for reducing interspecies tensions, though they were rarely implemented in response to immediate conflicts. Gracchus finally found his voice again, though the words came slowly and with obvious difficulty. I acted without honor, he said, each word seeming to cost him considerable effort. The female did nothing to warrant my aggression. I allowed old prejudices to guide my actions. The admission sent ripples through the watching crowd. For a Vorthan warrior to publicly acknowledge dishonorable conduct was almost unprecedented. It represented a fundamental shift in how the situation was being perceived by all parties involved. Marcus stepped closer to Gracchus, ignoring the significant size difference between them. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said quietly. "Especially in front of all these people. That's something I can respect." The human's words seemed to surprise the Vorthan warrior almost as much as Kira's forgiveness had. The concept of an enemy offering respect after a confrontation was another alien idea that didn't translate well into Vorthan cultural understanding. Orcs, the younger Vorthan who had been advising Gracchus throughout the incident, stepped forward with obvious nervousness. "Honored humans," he said formally, "my commander speaks truth. We came here with prejudice in our hearts and dishonor in our actions. How may we make proper restitution?" Elena Vasquez exchanged glances with Captain Torres before responding. "The first step would be a formal apology to Miss Kira," she said diplomatically. "Beyond that, we're open to discussing constructive ways to ensure this type of incident doesn't happen again." The security team leader was taking detailed notes of the proceedings, clearly relieved that what could have been a violent confrontation was turning into a diplomatic resolution. The station's reputation for maintaining peaceful neutral territory was being preserved. Though it had been a close call, Gracchus looked down at Kira, who was still standing courageously in front of beings who could easily harm her. The contrast between her small, delicate frame and his massive, armored bulk seemed to emphasize the cowardice of his earlier actions. "Young Zelani," he said formally, "I offer you the apology of House Vorth. My actions were dishonorable and brought shame upon my people. You showed grace and wisdom that I failed to recognize." Kira nodded acceptance of the apology, though she was clearly still frightened by the enormous warrior looming over her. "I accept your apology," she said softly, "and I hope we can both learn from this experience." The crowd began to relax as it became clear that the immediate crisis had passed. Several species began to disperse, though many remained to witness the full resolution of the incident. The presence of so many recording devices meant that this moment of reconciliation would be as widely broadcast as the initial confrontation. Margaret Foster approached the group with the confident stride of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize important moments when they occurred. "This is what civilization looks like," she announced to the assembled crowd. "Not the fighting, but the forgiveness. Not the conflict, but the courage to admit mistakes and make them right." Her words were clearly being recorded for broadcast, and she seemed to understand the historical significance of what had just taken place. This incident would become a case study in interspecies conflict resolution, referenced in diplomatic schools across the galaxy. Dr. Kim finished her medical assessment and approached the security team leader with her findings. "Minor injuries only," she reported. "Nothing that requires immediate evacuation or advanced treatment. All parties are cleared for continued participation in mediation procedures." The practical nature of her report helped bring the situation back to manageable proportions. What had seemed like a potential catastrophe was now being reduced to paperwork and procedures, the routine bureaucracy that kept galactic civilization functioning. Captain Torres activated his personal communicator and began making arrangements for the promised cultural exchange program. "I'm scheduling meetings between human cultural attachés and Vorthan representatives," he announced. "We'll also be extending invitations for educational exchanges between our species." The offer was generous considering that the humans had been the wronged party in this incident, but it demonstrated the human approach to conflict resolution, looking beyond immediate grievances toward long-term solutions. That would benefit everyone involved. As the crowd began to thin and the immediate drama subsided, the true significance of what had occurred began to sink in. A potentially violent confrontation between species had been resolved through a combination of human intervention, Zelani forgiveness, and Vorthan honor. It was exactly the kind of positive outcome that gave hope for the future of galactic civilization. 3 hours later, the dining area had returned to something resembling normal operations, though the atmosphere remained charged with the residual energy of what had transpired. The broken furniture had been cleared away, Statements had been taken and formal mediation procedures had been initiated. But the real work was just beginning. Marcus sat in a quiet corner of the station's medical bay while Dr. Kim finished treating his injuries. The cuts and bruises he had sustained during the fight were relatively minor, but Kim was thorough in her examination, knowing that adrenaline could mask more serious damage. "You know," she said as she sealed the last of his wounds with medical adhesive, "that was either very brave or very stupid. I'm still trying to decide which." Marcus flexed his shoulder, testing the range of motion after her treatment. "Probably both," he admitted. "But someone had to do something. You saw how scared that girl was." Through the medical bay's observation window, they could see into the diplomatic meeting room where the formal mediation was taking place. Kira sat at a large table alongside Elena Vasquez and several other human representatives. Across from them, Gracchus and his fellow Vorthons were engaged in what appeared to be intense discussion with their own diplomatic advisors. The sight of former enemies working together toward a peaceful resolution was remarkable, but Marcus knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. Changing attitudes and prejudices that had been building for generations wouldn't happen overnight. "The preliminary reports are already spreading through the galactic networks," Dr. Kim informed him, checking her personal device for updates. "The footage of the confrontation has been viewed by millions of beings across dozens of systems." Marcus grimaced at the news. He had never intended to become the center of an interstellar incident, but that seemed to be an occupational hazard of being human in the galaxy. Their species had a talent for ending up in situations that other beings found either inspiring or terrifying, depending on their perspective. "What are they saying?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know. "Mixed reactions, as usual," Kim replied. "Some species are calling it a perfect example of human recklessness and aggression. Others are praising it as a demonstration of human moral courage. The Zalani government has already issued a formal statement of gratitude." The mention of official government response reminded Marcus of the broader implications of his actions. What had started as a personal decision to help someone in trouble had become a diplomatic matter that could affect relations between entire species. In the meeting room, Elena Vasquez was presenting a detailed proposal for ongoing cultural exchange programs. The plan called for regular exchanges of students, artists, and professionals between human and Vorthan communities, designed to build understanding and prevent future conflicts. Gracchus listened to the proposal with obvious discomfort, but he was clearly taking it seriously. The warrior's reputation had been damaged by the incident, but his willingness to participate in the mediation process was helping to restore some measure of honor to his name. Captain Torres had joined the mediation session, bringing with him representatives from several other species who had witnessed the confrontation. Their testimony was helping to establish a complete record of what had occurred and why, providing context that would be crucial for future diplomatic efforts. The Genna warriors who had stood with the humans were also present, their massive forms somehow managing to fit into the station's human-sized furniture. Their participation in the mediation was significant, as their species rarely involved itself in conflicts that didn't directly affect Genna interests. Young Kira had proven to be remarkably resilient throughout the formal proceedings. Her initial fear had given way to a quiet determination to see the situation resolved peacefully. When called upon to provide her account of events, she had spoken with a clarity and maturity that impressed all the mediators present. "She's going to make an excellent diplomat someday," Elena Vasquez had commented after Kira's testimony. "The galaxy needs more beings like her." Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading through the station's corridors as travelers and workers shared their accounts of what they had witnessed. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always did, but the core message remained consistent. A human had risked his own safety to protect someone he didn't even know. The reaction from other humans on the station had been immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the incident, a fund had been established to cover any medical expenses Marcus might incur, despite the fact that his injuries were minor. More significantly, several human organizations had begun planning expanded outreach programs to help vulnerable species throughout the galaxy. Dr. Sarah Kim finished her medical report and submitted it to the station's record system. "You're cleared for normal activity," she told Marcus, "but I'd recommend taking it easy for the next day or two. Your body took more punishment than you probably realize. Marcus nodded his thanks and stood up carefully, testing his balance. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving him feeling every bruise and strained muscle from the fight. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional weight of what had transpired. As he prepared to leave the medical bay, a soft chime indicated an incoming message on the station's communication system. The voice that followed was immediately recognizable as belonging to the station's administrator, a dignified Centaurian whose diplomatic skills were legendary throughout the sector. "Attention all station residents and visitors," the announcement began. "Today's incident in Dining Area 7 has been resolved through successful mediation between all parties involved. The station administration wishes to commend all individuals who contributed to the peaceful resolution of this conflict." The formal announcement was diplomatic in its neutrality, but Marcus could hear the relief in the administrator's voice. Station officials lived in constant fear of incidents that might damage their reputation for maintaining peaceful neutral territory. Additionally, the announcement continued, the station will be hosting a series of cultural awareness seminars over the next several days, open to all species. These sessions will focus on building understanding and preventing future conflicts through education and dialogue. It was exactly the kind of response that gave Marcus hope for the future of galactic civilization. Rather than simply punishing those involved in the conflict, the station was taking proactive steps to address the underlying issues that had caused it. As he walked through the station's corridors toward his temporary quarters, Marcus was surprised by the number of beings who stopped to acknowledge him. Most simply nodded or offered brief words of thanks, but their gestures made it clear that word of his actions had spread far beyond the immediate witnesses. A young Alarian student approached him with obvious nervousness, her tentacle-like appendages writhing with anxiety. "Excuse me," she said in accented galactic standard. "Are you the human who helped the Zelani girl?" Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond to the sudden attention. "Thank you," the student said simply. "My people have also faced discrimination from stronger species. It means something to know that there are beings willing to stand up for others, even when it's dangerous." The encounter was one of many that Marcus would experience over the next few hours, as word continued to spread throughout the station. Each interaction reinforced the same message. His actions had resonated far beyond the immediate situation, touching beings who had their own experiences with prejudice and discrimination. By the time he reached his quarters, Marcus was exhausted both physically and emotionally. The day had started as a routine stopover during a cargo run, and had somehow transformed into a defining moment that would likely follow him for the rest of his life. 6 months later, Marcus found himself back at the same transit station, though this time his visit was entirely voluntary. The Galactic Cultural Exchange Initiative that had grown out of the dining area incident had become one of the most successful diplomatic programs in recent history, and he had been invited to speak at its first major conference. The station looked much the same as it had during his previous visit, but the atmosphere was noticeably different. Where once there had been the subtle tensions that marked most interspecies interactions, there was now a sense of genuine cooperation and mutual respect that surprised even the most optimistic observers. In Dining Area 7, now renamed the Unity Hall in commemoration of the incident, a diverse group of beings gathered around tables that had been specifically designed to accommodate multiple species. The sight of Vorthons, Zelani, humans, and dozens of other species sharing meals and conversation would have been remarkable just a year earlier. Marcus spotted Kira across the hall, now wearing the blue robes of a full diplomatic apprentice rather than the gray of a student. She had grown more confident in the months since their first meeting, her natural empathic abilities making her invaluable in the complex negotiations that were reshaping galactic relations. When she noticed him watching, she excused herself from her companions and approached with the graceful movement that characterized her species. "Marcus," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you could make it to the conference." "Wouldn't miss it," he replied honestly. "Besides, I wanted to see how you were doing. Last time we met, you were having a considerably worse day." Kira laughed, a musical sound that drew appreciative glances from several nearby beings. "That seems like a lifetime ago," she said. "Though I think about it often. That day changed everything for so many of us." She gestured toward a corner table where Gracchus sat with several other Vorthons, engaged in animated discussion with a group of human cultural specialists. The former mercenary had undergone a remarkable transformation, becoming one of the most effective advocates for interspecies understanding in the Vorthon military. He's been working with our mediation teams, Kira explained. His perspective as a former aggressor gives him unique insights into the mindset we're trying to change. He's probably prevented dozens of incidents just by helping others understand the warning signs. Marcus nodded, impressed despite himself. The idea that someone who had once threatened violence could become a force for peace demonstrated the potential for positive change that existed throughout the galaxy. Dr. Kim approached their conversation, carrying a datapad filled with statistics from the cultural exchange program. The results have exceeded all our projections, she reported excitedly. Incidents of interspecies conflict in participating systems have dropped by 47%. More importantly, we're seeing increased cooperation on everything from trade agreements to joint scientific research. The success of the program had surprised even its most enthusiastic supporters. What had begun as a response to a single incident had grown into a galaxy-spanning initiative that was fundamentally changing how different species interacted with each other. Elena Vasquez joined the group, her diplomatic credentials now augmented by her role as the program's chief administrator. We've just received approval for expansion into the Outer Rim territories, she announced. 3 more species have requested inclusion in the exchange protocols. The rapid growth of the program was creating its own challenges, but the overwhelming positive response from participating species made it clear that there was a genuine hunger for better interspecies relations throughout the galaxy. Captain, Torres arrived with news from the shipping networks. The Galactic Commerce Authority has just released their quarterly report, he said with satisfaction. Trade between participating species has increased by 32%. Apparently, understanding leads to trust, and trust leads to business. The economic benefits of the program had been an unexpected bonus, providing additional incentive for species to participate even when they weren't initially motivated by purely diplomatic concerns. Margaret Foster, now serving as an advisor to the program despite her advanced age, approached the group with her characteristic directness. The real test is coming up, she announced. The hegemony has agreed to send observers to next month's summit. If we can bring them into the program, it will legitimize the entire initiative. The hegemony was one of the galaxy's most powerful and militaristic alliances, known for their skepticism toward diplomatic solutions. Their participation would represent a major victory for the peace process, but it would also bring new challenges and complications. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself in conversation with beings from across the galaxy, each sharing their own stories of how the Cultural Exchange Initiative had affected their lives and communities. The diversity of perspectives was remarkable, but the common thread was consistent. The program was making a real difference in reducing prejudice and building understanding. A young Vorthon approached him with obvious nervousness, her movements showing the formal respect that her species traditionally reserved for honored warriors. Sir, she said carefully, I wanted to thank you for what you did. Your actions that day inspired many of my people to reconsider our assumptions about strength and honor. Marcus was struck by how different this young Vorthon was from the mercenaries he had faced months earlier. Where they had been aggressive and confrontational, she showed a quiet confidence that seemed to come from genuine self-assurance rather than the need to dominate others. What you did took real courage, he replied honestly. Changing your mind about things you've believed your whole life is harder than any physical fight. As the formal conference sessions began, Marcus took his place on a panel discussing the role of individual action in promoting galactic peace. The irony wasn't lost on him that someone who had become famous for getting into a fight was now being asked to speak about conflict resolution. The thing people don't understand, he told the assembled delegates, is that the fight was never the important part. The important part was that someone needed help, and helping them was the right thing to do. Everything else just followed from that basic decision. His words were being simultaneously translated into dozens of languages and broadcast to billions of beings across the galaxy. The simple message that doing the right thing matters, regardless of the consequences, resonated across species boundaries in ways that more complex diplomatic formulations had failed to achieve. Kira spoke next, her natural empathic abilities allowing her to connect with the emotional undercurrents of the diverse audience. "What I learned that day," she said, "is that fear and anger are not inevitable. They are choices, and we can choose differently." Her words were met with appreciative murmurs from the audience, many of whom had their own experiences with overcoming prejudice and fear. Gracchus took the podium last, his massive frame somehow managing to convey humility, despite his intimidating appearance. "I learned that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others," he said slowly, "but from the courage to admit when you are wrong and the determination to do better." The applause that followed his statement was thunderous, coming from beings who understood the difficulty of such public acknowledgement of past mistakes. As the conference continued over the following days, it became clear that the Cultural Exchange Initiative had grown far beyond its original scope. What had started as a response to a single incident had become a model for how different species could work together to build a better galaxy. Marcus spent his final evening on the station in the observation deck, looking out at the stars and thinking about how much had changed since his last visit. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, full of conflicts and misunderstandings. But there was now a framework for addressing those problems constructively. Kira joined him at the observation window, her presence a reminder of how far they had all come since that difficult day in the dining area. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just walked away?" she asked quietly. Marcus considered the question seriously before responding. "Probably nothing good," he said finally. "But that's the thing about doing the right thing. You never know how much difference it might make until you try." As ships arrived and departed from the station around them, carrying beings from across the galaxy, who were now connected by new bonds of understanding and cooperation, both Marcus and Kira understood that they had been part of something much larger than themselves. The simple act of standing up to bullies had somehow grown into a movement that was changing the galaxy for the better. It was, Marcus reflected, a very human outcome to a very human decision. His species might not be the strongest or smartest in the galaxy, but they had a talent for recognizing when something needed to be done and finding the courage to do it, and sometimes that was exactly what the galaxy needed most.